Hello, world, and welcome to the Elm Podcast. I'm your host, TJ, and I'm glad you're rocking with us today. The Elm Podcast is a celebration of knowledge. All are invited to kick it with us in our free space. See, we know what makes us us. It's all about personal experiences. But being open to grow and evolve for tomorrow, well, that's what makes our present today such a gift. So pull up a seat. Let's get ready to rock. Happy 9th day of September 2021. In this episode of The Elm, I'm actually going to go back a little bit and rehash some of my thoughts about the terror attacks September 11th, 2001. So being that this is the 20th anniversary and having some super good luck, I was actually able to find a working final copy of my senior thesis. So my thesis was entitled Racial Profiling in Policy Pre and Post 9/11, and it was written in December of 2002. So the events of 9/11 still fairly fresh, but I did have some ideas about how the United States and people in general could come together and figure out really what's next in the world. I know the baby boomers like to talk about their generation as being the greatest generation, but I think ours was. Not necessarily millennials, not the Generation Z. I think we've been called XY, but the people born between 1978 and maybe 1983, so a micro generation. But we really experience life differently than anyone else. We had no major incidents growing up. The fall of the Soviet Union was happening in the late 80s. We had the Iraqi invasion in the early 90s. But really the biggest thing for us was the Bill Clinton scandal with Monica Lewinsky. It was a time where people were free to travel almost the world. It was very common for seniors in high school and definitely college students to backpack across Europe and stay in hostels without fears or repercussions. There wasn't a strong anti-American sentiment out there. There were no Samantha Holloways. You know, you can go to a Caribbean island and get lost with the locals and then come back. We didn't really experience a big thing until 9/11 happened. Now, I'm sure some people can argue smaller events, such as Timothy McVeigh, the bombing in Oklahoma City. We had Columbine happen. We had the first attempts at bombing the World Trade Center. All small things in comparison to what was going to happen on that dreadful day. So everybody who's over a certain age remembers exactly where they were, and we know how the world has changed subsequently. We have to take off our shoes when boarding an airplane, thanks to Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. We know price inflation, changes in the stock market. There have been countless changes to our lives that are almost unimaginable prior to this. True story. You could have gone to an airport and had very little ID and still been able to get on a plane that was departing in 10 minutes, right? So the world was completely different. But I digress. The point of this is to pull up some of the thoughts of really a almost 21-year-old mind who in a year had started to see a drastic change in the behavior of other people. So, without putting my current thoughts on here, I am just going to read some excerpts from my paper titled Racial Profiling in Policy, Pre and Post 9/11. Hope you enjoy. The idea of racial profiling is significant in any discourse involving ethnicity, race relations, and disparities between the two within the United States. Regardless of our individual racial identities, profiling is similar to stereotypes where eventually all people will be affected. Today, as we live in a post 9/11 era, the significance is even more increased. Several scholars point out that racial profiling has been revived since the terror attacks of last September, when it seems as if the strides to end profiling were beginning to take place. The premise on which we will examine racially inspired profiling in America is founded in my belief that the strides to end racial profiling climaxed when the first plane crashed into the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, and subsequently descended by a slew of governmental laws and nationalistic leadership. Racial profiling can be broken down into three main chronological subdivisions. The first category is the foundation of modern racial profiling, which involves the history in the 1990s. After this period ends, the classification of the next period is a strong push to curtail and end racial profiling. This period has a significant amount of steam until the last period begins, which starts September of 2001 and can be classified as the post 9/11 period. Racial profiling is usually defined as police usage of race as the sole basis for initiating activity without the justification of suspicious behavior or reasonable information. The majority of the literature seems to signal that this is a critical time in the modern era of profiling. There were two common themes of this period: the inverse relationship that existed between profiling and crime rates, and the differential treatment of African Americans. The statistics during the 90s were staggering. Serious crimes had declined more than 20% since 1991. The number of murders in the U.S. dropped by over 35% between 93 and 1999, and the murder rate in 1999 was the lowest since 1966. However, at the same time, reports of negative race-inspired policing were increased. Jim Lightsoe writes, to some extent, racial disparities in citizen and police interactions are deliberate, as criminal profiles compiled by the police formally or informally employ race as one factor in identifying potential miscreants. So in practice, race appears often to be a decisive element in whether a stop is initiated or how an encounter is handled. This theme is reiterated through much of the scholarship on racial profiling. It is the most talked about link that has validity to the reduction of crime, whereas scholars point to a direct correlation between the increase in profiled stops and the decrease in criminal activities. However, the problem has been that the police have lowered the rate of crimes using techniques in a system that involves an unethical, proactive method, which in most cases may be illegal. So research by Albert Meehan and Michael Ponder, a quote taking says, disparate treatment by the police may not be the product of race alone. The racial class and composition of a neighborhood influences police behavior and citizens' perceptions of that behavior. So I think this brings in yet another concern into the issue of racially motivated profiling, which is neighborhood location. It is a fact that more crimes take place in the inner city than the suburbs, and the racial composition in the inner city is majority minority. Therefore, more police officers are patrolling these areas, and since the numbers of officers and the numbers of white officers are parallel, an increase in police presence means an increase in white officers. So the subsequent progression of this logic suggests that an increase in the possibility of stops, which means an increase in the possibility of racially inspired profiling. So this is something that has gone on for a very, very long time. I think it is really interesting that we are 20 years after 9/11. We have reached a crescendo of laws and actions in order to curtail racially profiled stops and racially insensitive policing, and also some deaths, which I will get to later. And it started up again, right? So in 2018, 2019, as we started to see this new social upheaval, some people call it wokeness, which is a term that conservative pundits use, and they've used many times over in order to minimize the impact of a social movement. Think of Me Too, Black Lives Matter, the list does go on. But this is not new, right? That is really a short-sighted view of current events, because these exact same things happened in the mid-1990s. Reading a little bit more. So one of the most blatant participators in the profiling was police officers. So scholars agree that African Americans were disproportionately policed due to the amount of information available that highlights the action taken by law enforcement agents. For example, in the state of Maryland, 70% of the drivers stopped between January 1995 and December 1997 were African Americans, even though they comprised only 17.5% of the drivers. In addition, some more just crazy facts. Blacks constitute 13% of the country's drug users, but 37% of those arrested on drug charge. Of that, 55% of those people were convicted, and 74% of all drug offenders were sentenced to prison. You add in the fact that many American communities are residentially segregated, and those citizens, they can fear African Americans and what they symbolize, right? And now these are stereotypes, but some stereotypes include danger, criminality, and property devaluation. So, smart people like Meehan and Ponder suggested that the underlying police practice of racial profiling is a contested preservation of place. And I'm going to stop right there. So that contested preservation of place is a very unique idea about ownership and people's place in a community. It is a theme that we will see as we continue to break down this thesis, but it is something that we see in the news today. It is a fear of other people as it relates to others' place in the world. I'm going to leave it there. What thoughts do you guys have? Let me know in the comments.